Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the FIDE World Cup being held in Baku, Azerbaijan. Now, as many of you know, I did play in this event and I was eliminated in the last round, but nonetheless, many of the favorites, including the former world chess champion Magnus Carlsen, Fabiano Caruana, and of course the runner-up in the last match against Ding Liren, Jan Nepomniachtchi, are all still alive. Now we're going to be taking a look at Magnus's games because he's playing against the Ukrainian legend Vasyl Ivanchuk, also known affectionately as Chucky. Now, Chucky needs no introduction. He's a player who's been around for many years. He's made some of the famed grades, including Garry Kasparov, look very bad in some classical games of chess, so a dangerous opponent to play. Same format as always, Magnus playing with the white pieces to start. So we get pawn to d4, Chucky plays d5, we get knight to f3, we get e6, and now this moves c4, knight to f6, and Magnus plays g3, which is the classic Catalan system. Now this is a system that Magnus Carlsen has used very effectively, most recently in his World Chess Championship match against Jan Nepomniachtchi in 2021. So Chucky plays bishop b4, we get bishop to d2, and now we get this move bishop to e7 being played here. Now on first glance you might wonder, well wait, hasn't black lost time? By checking and going bishop e7, the bishop's on d2 versus c1. You could go bishop e7 right away, and the bishop is not developed here. But the reason for this is fairly advanced, and it's primarily because in a lot of Catalan variations, white wants to put this bishop on b2 down the road with the knight on d2 or c3. It really depends where exactly black places pieces, but white wants his bishop on this diagonal versus the bishop being on d2. So we get this position after bishop to e7. The bishop is potentially on a diagonal where it's not doing a whole lot. So Magnus plays bishop g2 here. Chucky plays c6. If he were to capture right away, there's queen to a4 check, simply checking the king and winning the pawn on c4. So we get c6 here, and now Magnus plays queen c2 to guard the pawn on c4. If Magnus were to castle, black could potentially take this pawn, and after queen c2, there's b5 protecting it. So we get queen c2, knight d7, developing the knight. Black still wants to maybe go b6 and bishop b7, or b6 and bishop a6. Either way, you're developing this bishop on the diagonal. So we get bishop to f4, now castles, and here Magnus, also known as Stockfish Carlsen, plays this move h4. Now, one thing that Magnus has been doing that a lot of other top players have not done, he's been trying to incorporate some of these computer ideas from Stockfish and AlphaZero into his play. And this is a perfect example. One of the common things you'll notice in computer games at the top level is there are many situations where the computer recommends pushing the pawns on the edge of the board. Now, this goes against everything that you learn as a child playing the game. You're told, castle the king out of center, never push pawns on the edge, always play in the center of the board. But AlphaZero and, of course, Stockfish are about 3,700 plus level players, and they know better than any humans or any of our teachers from the past. Now, another example of Magnus trying to be creative with this h4 idea is from the recent World Cup as well, where in an earlier round against Aryan Tari, he pushed a pawn to h4. And just to illustrate that for you guys, there was a Nimzo Indian variation with bishop d2, where Magnus played this very unusual idea with f3, takes, sacrificing a pawn on c4, and after takes, check, g3, queen c4, he played this very creative idea with pawn to h4. Now, another example of this is in this exact same variation where in the Chess Bowl Masters earlier this year, Magnus played against the famous streamer Hikaru Nakamura, and in that game, Hikaru played rook e8. He did not play bishop a6 like Aryan, but after rook to e8, Magnus played h4. Anyway, that game would end in a draw, but these are a couple of examples where Magnus is trying to play like Stockfish and AlphaZero and trying to take his game to the next level. So, back to the game here. After we get this position with h4, Chucky decides to try and take on c4 right away, yielding a little bit of control in the center, potentially here where white could maybe go e4. But after such a provocative move like h4, it's understandable that Ivanchuk wants to be aggressive here, taking or playing c5. You feel like you need to do something because the common theme that we're taught is that when your opponent is pushing pawns on the edge of the board, the way that you counter that is by striking hard in the center of the board. And so taking or playing c5 makes a lot of sense based on the fundamentals that we know today. So we get pawn takes c4, queen takes c4, we get knight to d5, and now bishop g5 played here by Magnus, really making use of this pawn push, because without the pawn on h4, say your pawn is on h3, you could never go bishop g5, because hey, that's a free piece, why not? So Magnus already showing very good reasoning behind playing h4 that it supports this bishop g5 move, trying to trade off the dark square bishops. Ivanchuk plays h6, bishops come off the board, and now he plays e4, trying to remove the knight from the center. Here Ivanchuk plays knight b6. Now queen b4 is maybe a move here, but after knight b to d2 guarding the queen, when black trades the queens and moves the knight to b6, after knight to d6, white is getting this great bastion with the pawn supporting the knight on d6, and combine that with the central pawn control here, and it's going to be a very long and difficult game. So Ivanchuk plays knight b6. We get queen to c3 here, and now he plays e5. Now at this point, it's worth taking stock of the position. What we'll notice for white is that white has some good central control with the pawns here. White also has a lot more space. All these pieces are very, very cramped for black. So generally when you have a lot less space, there are two things that you're looking for, as I've said many times. Number one, looking for trades of the minor pieces, say the knights and the bishops, or trying to find pawn breaks. Now in this position, trading pieces is not realistic. There's no way to trade knights or bishops or anything here, so you look to pawn breaks. Now, the three pawn breaks that black has here are c5, e5, or f5. Now, f5 is maybe possible, but after knight bd2 takes, even though you get a central post for the knight on d5, after queen to d2, you have some slight weaknesses. One sample line is something like b6, castles, bishop b7, rook e1, and you have this big weakness on e6 down the road. So, Ivanchuk plays e5, and now Magnus decides to castle. He does not take this free pawn with d takes e5, because after a move like rook t8, black will be able to capture the pawn back on the next turn. So he decides to castle. Ivanchuk trades the pawns on d4. We get queen takes d4, knight c5, and now Magnus plays a very creative move, rook to c1. Now, this is a move that I think won Magnus the game, if I'm being honest, because this is the move where I think at this point, if you're looking at the position, you're thinking, okay, black should be okay here. There's pressure on the central pawn. If white plays a move like knight c3, you can go rook to d8, queen moves, and then you have something like rook d3, maybe even bishop g4. But black is finishing the development very, very quickly here, and black should be okay. So when Magnus plays rook c1 here, as I said, you're probably thinking at this point white has to guard this pawn. You're feeling like you're doing well, but rook c1 really puts the onus back on black, and you're feeling pressure again immediately. And the reason for that is that here you have to decide what to do with the knight. You cannot leave the knight here, because then I will simply capture it. If you take the pawn on e4, which is what the computer recommends, this probably is okay, but it's very, very hard to play in a human game, because after rook to e1, pinning the knight, you have to play f5, and after knight c3, rook d8, and queen to e3, it looks like white is getting quick development. Your knight is very loose on e4 down the road. Let's say you play a move like bishop d7, just to illustrate. After knight d2 here, let's say rook c8, takes. White should be a little bit better here. There's some weaknesses on this diagonal for black. Additionally, there's pressure towards this other diagonal. White can bring the rooks to center, and white just has very easy play. So without knowing what the computer evaluation is or what the perfect moves are, it's very hard to play this move. And Ivanchuk does not really, I don't want to say call Magnus's bluff, because it's not really a bluff per se, but he does not go for the most principled continuation with knight takes pawn. Instead, he plays knight to a6, basically banking on the fact that he can develop the bishop, bring the rooks in, and then bring some knights back to the center via c5 and the c4 square. So here Magnus plays knight bd2, protecting the knight and the pawn on e4. We get bishop to g4, bishop to f1 played by Magnus. Now, this is a move that I think is another awesome move from Magnus. It's a very deep, nuanced move. It's not a move that makes a whole lot of sense, because in this position, you're thinking about this light square bishop, and what do you want to do with this bishop? Now, this is the start of a plan that whether Magnus, I don't want to say he saw the whole plan throughout the game or not. This is the start of Magnus using this light square bishop with ruthless efficiency and slowly but surely winning the game. So after bishop f1, we get rook a d8. Magnus plays queen to e3, and now Ivanchuk plays knight to c7 here. He does not want to play a move like, let's say, I'll just say bishop h5, because after bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and rook takes c6, white simply has an extra pawn on the board. So we get knight to c7. Chuki's idea, reroute the knight to e6 and d4 potentially. Magnus plays a4, Ivanchuk plays knight c8, and now we get a5 anyway. Point is that what Magnus wants to do is restrict these knights. The knight on c7 cannot go to d5. The pawn on e4 also very well protected here, but this knight on c8 is a little bit awkward as well. Can't go to b6 because you lose the knight, and if you go to d6, you hang the pawn on a7 potentially, and white also has a6 to break up your pawn structure here, and it's very, very tricky to play. So here Ivanchuk decides to play bishop takes f3, and this is the mistake that I will say right now loses Ivanchuk this first game of the match. Now, you're looking at this and you're thinking, well, how can this lose the game? The reason this move will eventually lose the game is that this white bishop is now going to become a monster down the road. So let's keep going. We got knight takes f3. a6 played here by Ivanchuk. Does not want to allow something like a6 ruining the pawn structure, because here your pawns are very, very bad and white is much, much better. So he goes a6 here, and now Magnus plays rook to a4. Another amazing move based on really, really good understanding here, because he's not really trying to guard this pawn, even though it looks like it on first glance. But the reason that this move is so good is that after rook to e8, the logical developing move, putting the rooks on the central squares, there's now this move e5, and the reason behind rook a4 is revealed, which is that you can now start lifting your rooks, bruh, with rook to g4, putting pressure on the pawn on g7. One sample line, knight b5, rook g4, let's say knight a7, and after queen takes h6, you're simply getting checkmated on the king side. So after e5, we get knight to d5, which looks good on first glance. It looks like now your knight has a square in the center. But after queen to b3, this knight on c8 has big issues because both the b6 and d6 squares are covered. So what does Ivanchuk do? He plays knight a7, trying to bring the knight into the game via the square and getting it to b5. But now Magnus plays bishop to d3, knight to b5, and we get another amazing move, bishop to b1, setting up the classic double A battery, threatening checkmate with the queen and the bishop. Now at this point, it's very easy to start losing control, because the last few moves it felt like maybe white was a little bit better, but as soon as bishop b1 appears on the board, I suspect that Ivanchuk thought, uh-oh, I'm in a lot of trouble. I might even just be losing. Whereas probably 2 moves ago, he thought he was only slightly worse. So after bishop b1, we get h5 here from Ivanchuk, and the reason is quite simple. If you were to play, let's just say a move like knight c7, after queen c2, threatening the mate, g6, there's h5 here, undermining the pawn chain, and black is in a lot of trouble, if not completely lost already. So we get h5 here, so that after a move like queen c2, you can go g6, killing the threats of the double A battery, and there's no pawn push to h5 anymore. So we get rook e1 from Magnus. Ivanchuk goes knight c7. We get queen to c2, and now g6 is played. But here, Magnus showing how good his positional understanding is, plays this move bishop to a2, rerouting the bishop to a much better diagonal. Now, the threat here is quite simple. If black plays a move like rook d7, queen takes g6 simply ends the game on the spot. So we get king g7, breaking up the pin and guarding the pawn on g6. But now there's knight to g5, which puts a ton of pressure on this pawn on f7. And now we also see why h4 was such a good move to begin with. So here, rook to f8 is played by Ivanchuk. And now Magnus plays this move, pawn to e6. Now, this move is not the absolute best move in the position. The computer actually wants white to play this very nuanced idea with rook e4, taking away this knight d4 threat. But to a mere human like myself, and probably to Magnus, it's not clear where the win is after black plays knight to e6, takes, and in this position, computer thinks g4 is winning. But it's very deep, very complicated, and not clear-cut whatsoever, because maybe your king will become weak on g1 as well if black can go c5, and then something like knight d4 potentially. Now, it doesn't work here because white can sack the rook and win the game, but the ideas do exist. So Magnus decides, I'm just going to go all in with e6 here and open up this e-file and try to take advantage of the weak king, use the knight, use the bishop, use the rook, and just end the game immediately. So Ivanchuk plays f6 here, which is sort of the final straw. He needed to play knight to d4, and the reason that he probably did not play this move is for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's rook takes d4, takes on something like knight to f3, attacking the rook, and now when the rook moves to, say, b4, after e takes f7, the knight guards the rook, and when you go queen f6, there's a move like knight to e5, threatening knight d7, maybe threats towards the pawn on g6, and it just looks really, really sketchy. So Ivanchuk plays f6, Magnus goes bishop b1, which again, ruthless efficiency for Magnus here. He does not play knight f7, because after knight f7, rook takes knight. White actually loses the game. If you take the rook, queen takes e1, ends it. And if you play bishop b1, I just go f5, killing the diagonal. And if you don't take the rook, next turn I move the rook, and I have an extra horse on the board. So bishop b1 threatens the mate. Ivanchuk plays f5 to stop it. But now Magnus plays queen to c1. Another very nasty move for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you were to move the king, maybe black has knight d4 attacking the queen and the pawn at the same time. So when you go queen c1, knight d4 is now a blank. It doesn't do anything at all. Queen c1 also sets up another nasty trick, which is, say black plays knight d5, knight f7, you move the rook. Now the queen can go to h6, and out of nowhere, it's GG, why not? So queen c1, very nasty move. sidestepping the fork, threatening knight f7 and queen h6, and it's just very hard to play. Ivanchuk plays rook to d5 here, and now Magnus plays bishop to a2, another excellent move. He does not play knight f7, which on first glance looks like it might be okay, because after this unusual move, queen f6, queen to h6, and king g8, black is at least hanging on for another move because there are no checkmates here for white. That's not to say that white can't still win the game, but there's nothing that wins on the spot. But bishop a2 is the absolute best move. The computer loves it, and the reason is now the rook is under attack, and if you move the rook away, now knight f7 will attack the rook, regardless of which of these two squares you go to, and then queen h6 will end the game. So Ivanchuk plays rook c5, attacking the queen. We get queen to e3. He plays knight to d5, trying to sort of render this bishop on a2 useless. But Magnus just ignores it and plays queen to d2. And now the problem for black is the knights have no squares. Again, the rook on c5, very, very clumsy. No squares on the file. Knight on b5 can't really jump anywhere. If you go to d6, there's queen d4, which just ends the game right on the spot. So we get rook to f6. Here Magnus plays b4, trying to trap the rook on c5. Ivanchuk goes rook to c3. We get bishop takes knight. Pawn takes bishop, and now Magnus takes the pawn. And at this point, the smoke is sort of cleared, and white is completely winning, mainly because of this knight on g5, combined with this protected pass pawn on e6. Black basically doesn't have any attack on the king side here. The knight is supported, pawn is well protected. There's queen d7 to trade queens at the very least, and it's just totally hopeless. So Chuki plays f4, hoping for some kind of miracle on the king side. Magnus just decides to take the pawn, because why not? And after rook to f5, we get queen to e4. And here Ivanchuk resigns the game. He's down 2 pawns. But more than being down 2 pawns, there's really no counterplay here, because you can never move the queen due to this passed e-pawn. And you can never really move the knight because of the check on d4. The rook on f5, I guess, can go to f8, but it's not doing anything either. So all of black's pieces here are very passive. And all that Magnus really needs to do here to end the game is bring this rook to a1, d1, and d7, and that would be GG, why not? So a masterful game here in game number 1 from Magnus. Simply incredible. Found some really, really good moves. Bishop d3, b1, a2, combined with the queen b3 and queen c2. All in all, a spectacular game, and this is Magnus at his best. Where I suspected in this game, in this position after, let me just go back for a second. If we go back to the position like this after e5 or after rook a4 or e5, Magnus probably knew he was much better here. Chuki probably thought it was a little bit worse, but he probably didn't realize just how bad it was. Whereas Magnus already here, I think he had a pretty good idea that this was going to be extremely dangerous and he was going to get great winning chances. So an amazing game from Magnus. Really hard to be critical of anything. It's just a masterful game. Gave Ivanchuk no chances whatsoever. So now let's move to game number 2. So today, Ivanchuk playing with the white pieces, must-win situation. Ivanchuk starts with e4, Magnus plays e5, of course being very, very solid. As I've said before, if you're in a must-win situation with black, you can't really play e5, but if you're in a situation with white where it's must-win, e4, e5 is always going to be the most solid reply. So we get knight to f3, knight to c6, and now we have this move bishop b5, we get a6, bishop a4, knight f6 castles, all very standard here in the Spanish. We get rook e1, b5, bishop b3 castles, and now Ivanchuk plays a4. Now, there are many ways to play here. If you were to play c3, Magnus almost certainly would have played d5 with the classic Marshall Gambit. This system is considered to be very solid. Even today, it's almost unwinnable if you go into the actual gambit from the white side. There are many games that end in draws. This is a beaten horse. White has next to nothing. So essentially, white has 2 options. One option is to play a4 here. The other option is to play h3. Now, Jan Nepomniachtchi in his World Championship match against Magnus Carlsen in 2021, he did play h3 in quite a few games, and this system was also featured a lot in the recent match between Jan and Ding Liren as well. So this time, Ivanchuk plays a4. We get rook to b8, takes, and now we get this move c3. Now again, even here, this is very well known. A lot of theory here, but the thing in this position is that if black tries to play d5 and play the Marshall Gambit, after takes, knight e5, takes, c6, d4, bishop d6, rook e1, there is one big difference, which is that the a file is open here. So white can move this rook down to a7 down the road potentially, and black probably does not have enough counterplay, whereas in the traditional Marshall Gambit, which goes c3, d5, takes, c6, d4, bishop d6, rook e1. Black has many ways, but just to illustrate the point, at some point in this position, white has a very passive rook, and the big issue is the development of these 3 pieces. And if you go a4, black has bishop g4 followed by rook e8, and you're way too slow opening up the a file here. So that's why it's a little bit different here in this variation with a4. So back to the game. We get this position with c3 where Magnus plays d6. We get d4, takes. Now d5 played by Magnus, trying to contest the center. Ivanchuk plays e5. We get knight to e4, and now let's move knight to c3. Knight takes knight is played. Of course, you'll either lose the knight or the pawn if you don't capture. If you play, say, bishop f5, I just take the pawn. And if you play, if you don't play bishop f5, what was the other move? Say you play bishop e6, I can just take, and again, white simply has one extra pawn. So we get knight c3, bc3. Magnus goes bishop f5 here. Now, the issue that black has is these weak pawns here, but if black can somehow move this knight away, say black could go knight to a7, you get a position like this, just to illustrate the point, where you can get this pawn to c5 with a knight behind the pawn. Black is doing completely fine. So the only issue for Magnus in this position is this knight on c6 with this pawn on c7. Also, because another idea here, even if you can get to a position like this, is that if you have a pawn on c6, this also is completely fine because the pawn on c6 guards b5 and d5, and you can go knight b6 and knight c4. So we get queen d7 from Magnus here. After h3, queen d7, bishop e3, and now Magnus finds the other way to play for c5, which is with knight d8, eyeing the move knight to e6, and then playing for pawn to c5. Chuki plays knight d2. Now, it's worth noting that up to this point, Ivanchuk moving very fast, so probably this is some sort of theory, or he was just moving really quickly because he might be a little bit on tilt. So we get knight d2, Magnus plays b4. Now, this is a bad move from Magnus in this position. He probably should have just played c5, because after dc5 and knight to e6, white is maybe a little bit better with queen to f3, but black can play knight takes c5, and after a move like bishop takes d5, there's knight d3 forking the rook and the pawn. But again, this is fairly advanced, and with your opponent moving instantly, you don't necessarily trust these sorts of things. Sometimes you want to play a move that might not be the absolute best move, but takes your opponent out of their preparation. So Magnus plays b4, and the reason this is not the best move is that now white can play c4, and after bishop takes c4. The problem is that white has a nice open diagonal. White can maybe play for d5, but white also, after this move c6, has this idea of knight to b3, blockading the pawn on b4, and if black plays a move like knight to e6 here, white can go queen f3, let's say bishop g6, and after this rook a6 move, suddenly black is in a lot of trouble, because after rook c8, white can maybe even go rook c1 with ideas like knight a5, and black's position is very passive. White has a really nice bishop on c4, and it's very difficult to play. So, knight b3 would have been the best move, but one of the things that I mentioned is that when you do a lot of preparation and sometimes your opponent doesn't play the absolute top computer line, you don't have enough time to look at all these variations, and because of that, Ivanchuk immediately goes astray with this move queen to a4. Now, this move is not terrible by any stretch, but it sort of really reduces the chances of creating winning opportunities, because now you can't really use this a file. Maybe you can play queen a7 down the road. Let's say black were to play knight e6. Maybe you have queen a7. Black can always play rook b7. And you can't really bring the rook in because the queen is in the way now. So it's not necessarily a terrible move, but the ideas are not really obvious. And it seems to me that this is the start of Ivanchuk just moving quickly and losing the thread of the game. So here Magnus plays rook b7, a logical move to take away queen a7, but also to guard the queen. If you were to play knight e6 right away, white can actually play d5 here. You can't take the pawn because, uh-oh, spaghetti-o, there goes the queen, and the queen is not guarded, and black just loses on the spot. So when he goes rook b7, you stop queen a7, but you also guard the queen, and you intend to play knight e6 next to move. So we get knight to f1, Magnus plays knight e6, because obviously now after d5, you just trade, and black is winning the game. Probably here, Ivanchuk should have probably tried to play a move like f4 and g4, trying to push the pawns on the king side. But again, very hard to judge whether this actually makes a lot of sense. Instead, he plays knight f1. We get knight to e6, knight to g3 played, and now Magnus goes bishop g6, retreating the bishop backward. And at this point, Magnus has already pretty much blunted any attack or any big opening surprise that Ivanchuk had to begin the game with. We get rook e to d1, and now Magnus goes knight c7. Another very good move, intending to put the knight on d5. The knight on g3 actually is somewhat dominated by this bishop on g6. You don't have any jumps to either e4 or f5, and so if black can get this knight on d5 conceptually, now the bishop is doing nothing on this diagonal, and the knight can jump to c3, and so his bishop becomes useless, while your bishop on g6 dominates this knight on g3, and if you get this position, you're almost certainly going to win the game. So Ivanchuk plays queen b3, we get knight to d5, and now he plays rook a5, trying to attack the knight on d5. Magnus plays rook a7, another excellent move here, and we get rook a1. If Ivanchuk were to trade the rooks and take what looks like a free pawn on d5, this actually is really, really bad for a couple of reasons. I think bishop c2 is probably what Magnus would have played. Rook b8, also very good. But bishop c2 attacks the rook, and when you move the rook to c1 after b3, suddenly this pawn is marching down the board really, really quickly. And I think white, if he's lucky, can maybe draw the game, but no chances of winning. So in this position, Ivanchuk goes rook a1, rook a8 is played, and now all the rooks come off the board immediately. And at this point, it's very clear that Magnus is out of danger. And if anything, Magnus is probably the one who can try to win, primarily because he has this protected pass pawn on b4 and this bishop on g6, which dominates this knight on g3 and covers the queening square on b1. So here Ivanchuk plays knight e2, Magnus plays queen to a3, Ivanchuk plays bishop c1, queens come off the board, and now Magnus plays this move bishop d3. Now, the one thing that is particularly odd to me about this game is looking at the time usage. Now, I think somewhere around the moment of knight to f1, somewhere around here, I don't know if Ivanchuk was tired or running out of gas or what was going on, but he started playing all these moves very, very quickly, and it really just does go downhill very fast. So we get this position, knight e2, queen a3, Ivanchuk plays bishop c1, takes bishop d3. We get knight to f4, takes, and now c5 played here by Magnus. Now, it's very clear to me that at this point, Magnus would have been very happy to just make a draw here. But Ivanchuk, I think, just decides instead he's just going to move everything very quickly, and he proceeds to lose this game pretty fast. Here Ivanchuk plays e6, which is a very strange move to me. I think that you should just play g4 here. And the reason you should play g4 is black has one simple plan. First of all, white would love to bring the king closer, but you can't do that. You can't move the king, so the bishop can't push the pawn, because then I take your king. So g4 makes a lot of sense because you can maybe bring the king closer via g to an f3, but there's one other point, which is say you go h4, bishop f5, and g3. Black wants to go bishop e6 and exchange the light square bishops and push this b pawn down the board. So you really do want to stop that, and g4 stops bishop f5, bishop e6, and it gives you time to bring your king closer to the center of the board. So it's very strange that Ivanchuk played e6 here, because after king to f8, e takes f7, now there's bishop to g6, and black is getting his bishop on this diagonal, and in the process, white really isn't able to get the king over in time. So we get king f1, bishop takes f7, Ivanchuk decides to trade the bishops, he goes king to e2, Magnus plays bishop d4, and now Ivanchuk plays this very strange move, king to d3. Now in this position, if Ivanchuk had simply gone f3, after king to e6, king to d3, and b3, black is still quite a bit better, but I suspect that with correct play, this should be a draw. Instead, he plays king d3, which hangs the pawn on f2, and after bishop d2, bishop c5, we get king c4, bishop f8, and now Ivanchuk rather abruptly resigns the game. Now, I suspect the reason Ivanchuk resigned here is simply because he has no chances of winning, and he's going to have to struggle for another hour or two trying to play this position. However, this position is still probably a draw, because after g4, king to e6, and bishop f4, black has no entry here into the center of the board. d5, e5, and f5 are all covered by the bishop, the pawn, and the king. Now, black can play bishop d6, but after bishop e3, you still cannot enter with king e5, because then there's bishop d4 capturing the pawn, although maybe this is actually winning. According to the computer, maybe this is actually already winning, but just to illustrate the point, probably actually right back here. I'll set up here. What white should have done here, I think, is played. Maybe it doesn't work. Maybe this is all still losing after g4. I was thinking maybe you could still do something similar, but I guess it's going to be the same thing with bishop d6, where black can always simply sacrifice the pawn and probably win the game. Again, without table base, it's very, very hard to judge whether this is actually winning or not. I'm a little bit skeptical of this is winning, simply because it's the wrong color pawn to win the game with. But nonetheless, the point is that black will try to win this game. Now, I think it's most likely a draw, but you're going to have to suffer for another hour. And at this point, Shuki simply did not want to suffer for another hour trying to draw the game. So he just resigns abruptly. And with that, Magnus Carlsen wins this match very convincingly, 2-0. He does move into the quarterfinals. He most likely will play against Gukesh from India, the rising junior player who is now up to, I believe, number 7 in the world. So it's going to be a very exciting match, barring something weird happening where Gukesh loses today to Wang Hao. But Magnus continues to roll, so I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below if you haven't, and I will continue covering Magnus's games for as long as he is in the World Cup. Hope you guys enjoyed it. See you soon. Bye.